Hello dear Formula One fans and MSM friends, finally Suzuka again. Okay, it hasn't been that long since the last race in Japan, but of course we can't get enough of Suzuka. And for those who may not have noticed yesterday, that of course also applies to our Christian. But if you miss him now, he is unfortunately out of action due to injury. Get well soon to him again at this point. And of course, he's already working hard on his comeback, and you'll see him here in the videos again soon. You can also read about him now and of course in our new print edition. But now back to Japan, because today was the opening day and it was a bit of a mixed opening day. Crash in free practice 1, a huge farce in free practice 2. That's how I would describe it, and that's how I think we can describe it. Maybe we even have to. Let us know what you think in the comments. What happened? If you haven't seen it, it's about the second free practice session. And what happened there? Normally we say to ourselves, Suzuka, iconic, a fantastic track. We want to see that. The SS 130R, an absolute driver's track. Everyone loves to drive there. And yet in FP2, there was little to nothing happening on the track. The weather was not to blame this time. It was a bit damp at the beginning of the training session. After a quarter of an hour it rained a bit and there was a shower, but the conditions were not such that you could say no, you can't drive there. What was the problem then? The Formula One cars. They always like to say the modern ones, the aerodynamics, the ground clearance, aquaplaning. That wasn't the reason either. This time it wasn't the cars, but something completely different. So what was to blame this time? It's the rules. A rule that has been abolished, an article that has disappeared from the regulations. It's the 30.5G article. Yes, I know normally Christian always throws the articles and paragraphs around. This time I have to do it here. And it's a very simple paragraph because it says in article 30.5G, an additional set of intermediates may be used in the free practice sessions. This must be returned if it rains before qualifying. So there is no unfair advantage that you simply hoard them, others drive with them, and I have one more set of tires in qualifying or the race. That no longer exists. That means they've changed something else a bit. Full wets, which nobody in the paddock really liked anyway, are still the same. So we only bring 2 instead of 3 of those and one more set of intermediate tires. So 5 instead of 4. Now you might be thinking then everything is fine, we still have one more set of tires. Unfortunately not, because now the teams come into play and the teams are always reluctant to waste tires when they might still be able to use them, and it could rain again for the rest of the weekend. We know it's always the case that it could rain, and that means they wanted to save the 5 sets of tires from the intermediates, so hardly anyone drove in the second free practice session. The Japanese fans, of course, take everything in their stride. They are also happy when they don't see any cars on the track or only a few. Elsewhere, it would probably have been a bit different, and probably some of those who got up a bit earlier to watch the practice session before work will also say to themselves, what kind of nonsense was that? I think we should think about the rules a bit more and work and refine them so that the whole thing changes a bit. Why is Pirelli doing all this? Quite simply, they want to save money, saving resources in the production of the tires and of course in transporting them to the track. The fewer tires, the better it is. But in this case, the fans suffer, and of course Formula One as a whole suffers. If we think about it now, if we're being nasty, you could say that Williams is a team that knows its way around a few or hardly any missing components. And I said at the very beginning, in free practice 1, there was a crash, there was a bang, and that was Williams again. They were already the big issue in Australia when Alex Albon smashed up his car in free practice and damaged the chassis, which his teammate Logan Sargeant then got. That was also a subject again on Thursday in Suzuka. And what was the matter then? They said it was no problem, even if Sargeant now gets the repaired Albon crash chassis and not his own intact one back. After half an hour or a good half hour in free practice 1, it was all over again. Crash, this time it was Sargeant, this time it was also his own fault. A driving error on his part, he misjudged, didn't know exactly where the car was on the track and in which position, and then boom, he flew out into the gravel trap, crashed head-on into the tire stacks and caused a lot of damage with this. What is all broken? James Vowles first gave the all clear and said, yes, it's not the chassis. The chassis is not broken, which means they can continue driving. But apart from that, pretty much everything else is broken, especially the suspension and the gearbox. This means that Williams will have to do a lot more work. That's why he couldn't drive in FP2. This time it was his own fault, unlike in Australia when he was unable to take part in the rest of the weekend. But the problem, he didn't actually have that much of a problem because there wasn't too much driving thanks to the weather or the tyre situation. Sargeant, of course, apologized for this and said, quite clearly, my mistake, it was a stupid mistake. The team boss defended him and said, okay, it can happen. It wasn't that he drove too much over the limit, that it was similar to his accident in qualifying last year at a different place on the same track. But he said, yes, that's something that can just happen. That's a mistake that could happen anywhere. Whether that's such an incredibly good thing to say to your driver, yes, a mistake like that can happen to him anywhere. I'll leave that to you, or I'll leave it to others to judge. But all in all, not a good day for Williams and what happened to them again. The important thing now is to get back to work, fix the thing, and then just see how things go on Saturday. In any case, we're not only continuing with our videos and on our website, but especially now in our new podcast. You've asked for it, and if you want something, it's our command, and now you have to pay for it, because from now on, there's also an MSM podcast with Christian, Marcus, Robert, and myself. We'll be talking about everything that's going on in the paddock, the most important topics, and of course, answering your questions. You are also welcome to send us an audio message. You can find them wherever there are podcasts, as they say, or here on YouTube on our talk channel. Just jump over there. There are videos and this podcast. Just listen to what exciting things there are to do. And now we've talked about frustration and anger in the first and second free practice sessions. Mercedes fits in quite well at the moment, and Flo will now tell you a bit about that.
Yes, for Mercedes, the race weekend began with bad news, because many of you will probably remember that Lewis Hamilton's engine blew up in Australia. Now, there was a lot of analysis, a lot of testing, and Toto Wolff came to the conclusion it's a case for the dustbin. This engine cannot be repaired and therefore, of course, cannot be used again for the remainder of this season. This is a big blow for Mercedes because it drastically increases the likelihood that Hamilton will have to take an engine penalty at some point this year. Specifically, what had to be replaced: the combustion engine, the turbocharger, the MGU-H, and the MGU-K. They have 4 of each of these components available, and now comes the small relief for Mercedes, namely, there are still 4. Last year there were already 4, and this year the quota should actually have been reduced to just 3. That was then overturned at short notice, which means that there may still be some hope that Mercedes and Hamilton can get through this year without an engine swap, which is outside the quota and entails a penalty. But it could still go well for Mercedes. But what exactly was the problem? That's what came out of the analysis, and of course Toto Wolff didn't want to say exactly. He only said that it was a highly unusual hardware fault. Unfortunately, we don't know what exactly. But it's not all bad at Mercedes this weekend, because in sporting terms, they were in a great mood after free practice 1. FP2, as Stefan mentioned earlier, that was nothing. We can't draw any added sporting value from it. But in FP1, at least Mercedes had the feeling that everything was going much better than on the other race weekends so far this season. Lewis Hamilton even said it was the best session we've had this year. What makes him say that? Yes, the handling, the driving feel was a lot better than at the last Grand Prix. That's always been such a big component, which has attracted so much criticism, namely that the car still behaves strangely despite all the changes. And that is apparently supposed to be better so far this weekend. But he also said, Hamilton said, that you have to be careful now not to make too many changes, because Mercedes had one problem in particular this year. Several times they have started a race weekend relatively well, and then it didn't get any better. On the contrary, it actually got worse. That was the case in Saudi Arabia. It was also partly the case in Australia. And now, possibly again, of course, the Mercedes fans hope not, but we'll see. But What also helped Mercedes a lot, or could have helped, it has to be said, was the weather. Because the temperatures were relatively low, which means that in the past, this has always been a good playground for the Mercedes, who has had problems in high temperatures. George Russell and James Ellison said that the problem was no longer so bad, or that it had been cured a bit and the car should perform much more consistently in all conditions. But we still need proof of this. Above all, it would be important for Mercedes to perform well now because Suzuka has not necessarily been a Mercedes track in recent years. Others have ruled there, Red Bull of course, but McLaren has always been very strong there too. We'll have to see now. Perhaps this could be the start of a resurrection for the silver team. However, despite all this optimism, it has to be said that in the end, they were half a second behind the two Red Bulls, or rather Max Verstappen, and therefore well behind Ferrari. So all that glitters is not yet gold, and the long runs were anything but spectacular. Even though you always have to be a bit careful in FP1, of course, because we know that everyone is running a slightly different program, which is not as comparable as the long runs in FP2. That's why we'll have to wait and see what happens as the weekend progresses. Of course, this also applies to the other balance of power this weekend. Ferrari had the feeling after free practice, and both teams, the drivers and the people in charge, said that they were a bit closer to Red Bull than we would have expected. And where McLaren stands, we generally can't really assess that yet, because the long runs, they ran a completely different program than the competition. Probably with significantly more fuel, it's still too early to tell. Plus, on the fast laps, Logan Sargeant's red flag got in the way. That means we don't have a reference value for where they stand. And especially with these two drivers, Mercedes would probably be 2 places further back and the whole situation would look a bit worse. But we'll find out exactly what the performance is like this weekend. What we won't find out, or probably won't find out for the rest of the weekend, is how the driver market is developing. Namely, it's all about the cockpit at Mercedes. We already talked about this in detail in yesterday's video, namely that Lewis Hamilton has made a strong case for Sebastian Vettel as his successor at Mercedes. Now Toto Wolff has also commented on this. I have to say something briefly. Wolff didn't actually want to be in Japan this weekend. The original plan was for him to stay in Europe and for the team to go to the Grand Prix without him. This has been done several times in the past. Of course, it's always a big travel burden, which is why he skips a few races a year. But in this case, he was there anyway at short notice and then gave longer answers, including to Vettel and another driver. But first we come to Vettel. He said that yes, he's someone you can never write off and his track record is phenomenal, but he didn't quite want to say whether Vettel is on the list or, more importantly, how high up he is on the list at Mercedes and therefore whether he has a chance of getting the cockpit. But above all, he also emphasized that no decision has been made yet, neither in the direction of an experienced driver nor in the direction of a newcomer. And that brings us to the second point, namely Andrea Kimi Antonelli. Many of you probably already know the name. He is a Mercedes junior driver who is racing in Formula 2 and is being touted as a super talent. Many already see him in Formula 1 next year. He actually skipped Formula 3 completely after winning everything there was to win in his career. And now he is also allowed to drive a Formula 1 car, namely at the end of April. As confirmed by Wolff, he will take his first seat in a Formula 1 car from Mercedes, but in one from 2021, which is relatively interesting. In 2021, the old regulations were still in force, which means no ground effect and therefore relatively little comparison with the current cars. And now perhaps some of you will remember that you are actually allowed to test with the current cars, not with those from this year, but with those from 2022 and without regulation, namely under testing previous cars. And that means he could actually have driven the Mercedes car that is 1 year newer, theoretically. But Mercedes themselves don't want that because they are not particularly satisfied with the 2022 car. And then Toto Wolff said, yes, we want to give him a feeling for driving a good car. When that came a year later, the 2022 W13, it wasn't so good. However, Antonelli will be able to take a seat in it later this year and do a few laps. A very long test program is planned, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything with regard to the Mercedes cockpit, because Toto Wolff said that everything has been prepared for some time and has been fixed for months. What has now changed is that a few days have been added. In other words, we don't necessarily have to expect any repercussions with regard to Hamilton's successor, because Antonelli is already being discussed elsewhere in Formula One, possibly as a transitional year at Williams, but possibly also directly at Mercedes. And that was, of course, the very optimistic option in this case. But that's it for Practice Friday for now. Tomorrow is Saturday. Qualifying is on the agenda, and then we'll see what the balance of power actually looks like. But if you can't get enough of motorsport, then you can also read a bit about us. Not only on our website, but also in our new magazine, or rather it's still the new one, but not for long. You can get number 95 now at abo.motorsport-magazin.com. We promise you that number 96 is also almost on its way and is currently being prepared. So if you have someone to give a present to, or if you want to get even more motorsport knowledge yourself, click here